What's up, y'all? A little faith, and welcome to episode number 14 of the Fagnostic Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Hayes.
Never heard of her.
If I'm still giving you episodes, it means that I'm still looking for answers. Today, I have perhaps one of the most important conversations I've had on this podcast yet. Imam Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed is calling in from France.
That's French for yes, queen.
To speak about his journey as a progressive Muslim and his successful efforts in promoting the true teachings of Islam.
That's Arabic for yes, queen.
It hasn't been easy. He was born in North Africa and later migrated to France. While being exposed to a more progressive mystical Islam, he was also dealing with his sexuality as a gay man, as well as dealing with another new status, HIV positive. His spiritual journey has taken him all over the world, studying all major religions only to bring him back to Islam, back to peace, back to who he is. He founded the internationally consulted Kalam Institute, which advises, counsels, educates, and activates governments, legislation, imams, and communities on progressive Muslim values. He works tirelessly to advocate for equality, equity, and love from true Islamic principles. You can find more about his sociological and geopolitical work, as well as all his writings and editions at calem.eu. That's CALEM.eu. So welcome to the show, Dr. Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed. Ludovic, thank you so much for being here. You are several hours ahead of me in France, and we are accommodating both of our time zones right now. So I genuinely appreciate you being willing to stay up late and hang out with me for a little bit. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah. So every episode starts off with two questions. The first of which is, are you a believer?
Oh, yes, very, very much. Deeply a believer since I was a kid. I don't really know why, but I was very much attracted to philosophy and spiritual practices. And then I had that influence from my grandmother, from my father's side, who used to be a Sufi, peace be upon her, a branch of mystical Islam. So she taught me as much as possible about that. So yeah, since the beginning of my life. That was hard because I'm also queer, I'm homosexual. And they tell you in my tradition, like the clerics and the scholars, the traditional dogmatic patriarchal ones, that you could not be both, that you have to choose between one side of your identity, either your spirituality or your sexuality. But yeah, thank God I'm trying to live both at the same time, just being myself, and it works pretty well. Thanks,
yeah.
God.
Well, and thankfully your voice is one that is heard, and there's a lot of people just like you who are trying to find that balance between spirituality and sexuality and to reconcile the two. So I'm excited to hear how you have achieved that and what your message is to those trying to do the same. You mentioned mystical Islam, which I've never heard that phrase before. So I want to circle back to that in a second. But can you just quickly identify your pronouns for me?
He and him.
He and him. Thank you so much. So tell us who you are. You briefly mentioned your childhood with your grandmother teaching you about mystical Islam. But where were you born? Were you born into a family that identified as Muslim?
Yes, I was born in North Africa, in Algeria, the capital Algiers. I grew up there mainly. And then we had to move to Marseille, southern France, where our institute is located nowadays. It was in 1995 during the Algerian Civil War. And then there I was studying Islamic studies for 5 years to become an imam.
And imam is basically a priest or a reverend in Islam, right?
Kind of, yeah.
Like a religious leader.
Absolutely, a facilitator. I would choose this terminology rather than leader, because theoretically, and that might sound weird, but we're not supposed to have leaders in our communities. We're supposed to be, praying face to face with God and things like that. But unfortunately, you always have, like in any community, like patriarchs with a lot of money and power who are trying to impose that, very, very dogmatic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, misogynistic representation of Islam. But then when I moved to France, I discovered another face of Islam, a more progressive, inclusive Islam. And I also had the opportunity to live my sexuality, my homosexuality, because in Algeria, you can have, like, for what I say, up to 10 years of jail
Oh my
just
gosh.
saying that homosexuality is not something wrong and that's natural and so on.
And that still is punishment that is uh, enforced in Algeria?
Yes, absolutely. Up to date, it's a big problem. We're still working with several North African organizations, LGBT progressive Muslim organizations, in order to put forward the fact that human rights and LGBT rights are part of the universal values defended by the kind of, I would say, the true Islam, even though it sounds weird, but Islam in Arabic, it's supposed to mean peace, being at peace. That's what it means. So when
Right.
people are starting to use that beautiful tradition in order to make it a weapon, literally on the back of minorities, ethnical, religious, and spirit and sexual minorities, that hurts a lot. Of course, the people who are discriminated, but the entire Muslim community, because many of us do not recognize themselves in those patriarchal, fascistic identities spread within Muslim communities worldwide, and that's why also I think we are raising our voices in order to attack those violent representations of our
Mm-hmm.
faith tradition.
So you're trying to combat the violent representation of this religion. Are you getting backlash? Are you getting threats from people from the patriarchy within extreme Islam that are threatened by what you're doing?
That's a very interesting question, because we had a lot of we had much more people telling us, "You are the true Islam. You're giving us hope. We are not Muslims, but we want to learn more about your representation of Islam," and so on and
Yeah,
so forth. We had some people, sending us on social media like hate messages and so on. But that's very easy. Anybody can do that. But nothing
sure.
ever happened to us, thanks God, because I think that people are more and more aware that something has to change in terms of how can I say in English, in terms of exclusive identities. I'm like this, you're not like me, so I'm gonna fight you back or
Yep.
exclude you from the society, and so on and so forth. And that's happening more or less everywhere in the world, but especially in African and Middle Eastern countries, where misery, unfortunately, and war for resources and so on are at the highest historically. So I think that the two factors are related, of course. The more people are feeling endangered, experiencing misery in their everyday life, the more they're going to use their culture, their religion, their everything in order
Mm-hmm.
to reject others and make their own community survive. That's an animal instinct. I can understand it theoretically as a psychologist. I do not understand it, absolutely not, or accept it. At least I do not accept it as a theologian. Yeah.
Right. Wow. Uh, can you go back to mystical Islam? And because it kind of reminds me about some of the studies that I've had, like with looking at the Kabbalah as it relates to Judaism and stuff like that. So tell me about mystical Islam.
Yeah. That's a very, very beautiful part of it, because you find that kind of mystical um, enlightenments, pearls of wisdom in every human religious tradition. That's part of human cultures, and that's the very important thing. that I discovered when I studied also Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism especially, because I wanted to learn more about other traditions, other mystical practices in other cultures, and how queer, progressive communities put the human rights and equality for all agenda forward within their religious, faith-based communities without, too much backlash, too much violence in return, because that's not the point. My goal, of course, was at that time, 15 years ago, when I started to work on those topics, to create more peaceful dynamics and not to create more tensions and rejections. So I discovered that you have, um, uh, um, practices like meditation and fasting and energetical healing like Reiki, pretty much in every human religious traditions, which could not be a coincidence, and makes it even more valuable for our self-empowerment, because this is like tools that we can use, that we are using for centuries in Islam, like in other traditions, to make of us better human beings. So it's like working on ourselves, using spirituality to be more connected to the universe and to other human beings and to ourselves, of course,
Yeah.
in a way, because there's so many people, especially if you're queer or woman or part of um, religious minority in some countries. There's so many people telling you that you're not as human, as worthy as they are,
Yep.
and infra-humanizing you, telling you that your humanity is not as good as there. So
Mm-hmm.
you,
And they do
I,
that because it creates a need for the follower to then be delivered by the quote unquote leader. And so in that you have there's an enforcement of a power structure, and it just keeps people down and keeps they or them, whoever it is, up. But it sounds like what you're saying too is really recognizing the commonalities in the major religions, so that whatever culture you're brought up in, you then have these tools to reach the divine based on kind of how you were brought up. Is that right?
yes, thanks, Matt. You said it all. That's exactly the point. The point is to find out where those traditions are coming from. They're not falling from the sky. We created them. We
Yep.
wrote down those books, those holy books. They're holy because they mean so much for our humanity, for generations of believers who reflected upon those values and tried to implement them in their everyday life. So
Mm.
finding the commonalities, despite the different colors, which is great, different colors, but the same basis of human universal values. That's very important, I think, especially nowadays.
Yes, I agree. But again, there are people benefiting not just politically, but religiously from putting the wedge in between these major religions for the sake of power and control. I mean, look what's happening right now in the Middle East. I mean, I think it was last episode or two episodes ago, I started realizing that the Taliban is no different than the GOP. The Taliban's seemingly meeting the religious needs of a community in order to stay in power, just like how the GOP, through anti-abortion laws, through anti-LGBTQ equality, they are meeting the religious needs of a community in order to stay in power. It's just
Yes, yes, absolutely.
the worst of grievances in my mind spiritually.
No, no, absolutely. And that's really an abomination, to use a word that they love so much to put on our back, because the true abomination is to use something so beautiful as spirituality, uh, and to make out of it something that is going to reinforce your power on the back of the poorest people amongst your population, amongst
Yeah.
your community. That's
It,
very ugly, of
yeah.
course.
It's just exploiting God, exploiting the divine, which I'm
Absolutely.
sure that there's going to be payment for that at some point. So you have been a huge force in getting your religion of Islam to be more aware and inclusive of the queer community, of gender equality, but even on federal levels. You worked with, I think, France to legislate gay marriage, right, through the Callum Institute.
Absolutely. We were consulted by the government in 2012, especially in order to help them create the best law in terms of opening the marriage for all citizens. We also work regularly with the European Union Fund in order to organize meetings and conferences and training for Muslim youth in Europe and elsewhere in North Africa. We work also with the United Nations, with universities. We try to have as much collaborations as possible in order to make, first of all, of course, our activities and our people visible and integrated into the society, but also to learn from one another in order to get more tools and expertise in order to transmit that expertise to our youth, especially in Muslim community. That I talked about misery before, but the lack of education is also the best ally of fascism and violence. So the best way to fight back that violence is empowerment, economical empowerment, and education, of course.
How did Callum come about?
It came up 20 years ago because we wanted to work on intersectional issues like being queer and HIV positive and migrant and so on at the same time. And then we added on top of that, because it was not complicated enough, I guess, we added religion, like how religion could be a tool of empowerment for some people, and so much violence coming from some religious clerics and powerful men at some other points in other contexts. So we wanted to study that intersectionally, like crossing different factors like ethnical background, religious convictions, sexual orientation, and so on, and try to understand how people are able to build their life and their identity and affirm who they are with those factors in mind. Like, how could you be queer, HIV positive, Muslim, migrant at the same time? Do we have, all of us, something to know and to learn from you, because you have like an expertise in terms of surviving all of that? So yeah, that was crazy. All the data we got from that point of view. Then we started publishing, of course, books and articles about that. We attracted some attention and collaborations and confederations. And in the end, after 20 years of work, we are here talking about what became a movement, because we discovered, maybe that's the most important thing, we discovered we're not alone. People are doing that in North America, in South Africa, in North Africa, Indonesia. There's a trans imam there with a little school where they do the same kind of
Whoa. There's a trans imam in Indonesia?
Trans imam, and you also have like trans people taking responsibilities, and that I would call imams also in North America. I believe it was, I met some of those queer imams when I was there during Ramadan for different several conferences in different cities in the USA. It was amazing to see everything that's happening there for years, because they started what we call inclusive progressive mosques a few years, 6 years before we did in Europe. Because when we created the first European inclusive mosque in Paris in 2012, we already had like 5 or 6 chapters of Muslim for progressive values with Annie Zundveld and other great people in USA and Canada. So
yes, and we love Ani here. She was on an episode a few episodes ago, and I just want to make sure my listeners hear an accolade that you just that I want to make sure is recognized, and that is that you helped to form the first inclusive mosque in Europe in 2012.
And that was in Paris in 2012, absolutely, which means that it's a mosque still running today, led by 2 women now. And it means that it's a mosque where everybody's welcome to come. you're Muslim, you're queer, you're not a Muslim, you're coming from another background, or you're even not believing in a God, like atheist or deist or whatever, you're more than welcome to come and join us for meditations and discussions about those topics, because it's very important to put everyone around the same table and to discuss who we are and where we want to go in the future altogether. We have no choice but to live all together. And sometimes I have more humanistic values and proximity with someone who is not a Muslim, who is even an atheist, than with someone who calls himself a Muslim, but he is full of hate against people who are not, under quotes, like him.
Right. Why did you stay devoted to your faith, Ludovic? Because I mean, you were just saying a bit ago about how, you were identifying as queer, as Muslim, as immigrant, as HIV positive, as all these things that seem to go against the people that led your faith. Why not leave? What made you maintain a faith in your God?
That's also a very good question, but I tried another system of belief or in belief. I was an atheist, I was a Buddhist, and then I came back to Islam because that's me. That's part of myself. And you know what? I have found exactly the same human abominations and temptation of discriminating others in all communities, unfortunately. So
Yes.
some people say God does not exist, but God is responsible for everything, that the most ugly part of ourselves. No, it doesn't work like that, unfortunately. The divine is within us and the devil also. So I think that I have come to a point where I was tired trying to reinvent the wheel. I'm just using who I am, the way I am, affirming myself both as, Muslim, queer, HIV positive, formerly a migrant living in France, coming from North Africa. That's a bit complicated, but yeah, it's also very rich. But trying to change who we are just because there's so much pressure here or there, it doesn't work, because you always find it somewhere else. Yeah, and when I tried to convert to Buddhism, I was like, no, but this time I'm gonna go to the source of this tradition. So I went to do a pilgrimage in Tibet. That was so beautiful. I was meditating with monks in temples and so on. Crazy experience. That was great. But at the same time, even though it's not written anywhere in their books, I have found people telling me, oh, women are not exactly like men. Maybe one day they will be incarnated in a man body. One day they might become a Buddha. So that sounded very Islamic to me, in a way,
Yeah.
patriarchal and fascistic. So that helped me to understand more, so many things about why do we pray and meditate and so on, because the Buddhist tradition is so rich in terms of inputs concerning meditation. But at the same time, I've seen also that some human are, injecting their poison and their fears in their tradition, and they call that God everywhere. It happens everywhere.
Yep.
So yeah, I just try to do my best to be myself, not trying to cut one arm my sexuality or the other arm my spirituality. And I try now to help people make their own choices in order to empower themselves the way they want, wherever they're coming from, but especially if they're coming from Muslim African backgrounds, of course.
Wow. You mentioned a second ago about how the God is in us and the devil is also in us. And it reminds me of because we don't want to admit that, especially people who subscribe to a faith system, they only want to recognize the good, which to me allows the bad to sneak up on you, within you. And it reminds me of, there's an old myth, or I don't even know where its basis is, but it's the story of the two wolves. And it's basically a teacher and his student are out in the woods, and they come across two wolves who are looking like they're ready to fight, identical in stature, identical in muscle mass and energy. And the student says to the teacher, well, who's going to win? How do we know who's going to win? Or how do we help the good one win? And the teacher basically just says, which one are you going to feed? You're going to, if you want the good one to win, you have to feed the good one. If you want the bad one to win, you have to feed the bad one. And so it just kind of reminds me that we have the ability, in recognizing the duality of good, bad, and everywhere in between, that we have a job to do in utilizing whatever tools we're given from the divine or from our communities to feed the good wolf, because otherwise the toxin of the bad wolf can sneak up on us, I feel like, and start to lead the way, which is scary, which I think is also what's happening a lot in the world right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another beautiful story. Thanks for that one. In the Quran, it is said that when God created human beings, God asked the angels, who are like artificial intelligences of praying and obeying and so on. So they are like perfect in a way for what they have to do. God asked them to bow in front of human beings, and some of the angels ask, "Oh, why? Because we're praying all day long, and aren't you satisfied with your creation in us, within us?" So God would have said, according to this story, that no, but you will see, because I will give them knowledge and freedom of choice. So that's at 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 some point the biggest blessing ever, because we like participating to the creation of God on earth. But at the same time, yeah, we can destroy ourselves and everything around, especially now with all the weapons we have and the chemicals we're spreading in nature and so on. So that's a huge responsibility. That's what we call in Arabic al-amana. That's a responsibility in front of ourselves, because God, if God really exists, I believe so, and God is almighty and all powerful and so on, it's not going to be a big mess for God if there's no life on earth anymore. But that's how we're learning, trying something, making mistakes, and trying to come back to ourselves. Some people call that repentance, but etymologically, also in Arabic, tawbah means coming back to ourselves. Like the Christian liberation theology in the 50s, last century in South America, when they started developing that idea that coming back to God is coming back to our true self, first of all.
That's so interesting. Coming back to God is coming back to yourself, because, as you're saying, God is within you, God is within us. And that's where, as an agnostic, I don't, that's why I have this podcast, is to help. It's a selfish desire to figure out what I believe. But, what I'm beginning to develop a belief of is that if there's a God, it's not necessarily like in this and in that. It's in these spaces between. It's in the dialogue you and I are having right now. That's where the divine lives. And to me, that feels a lot more communal and safe than just being like, within Christianity, it's all about, have you accepted Jesus into your heart so that the Holy Spirit is within you? And I think it just really overcomplicates an innate belief system that we sense on our own. And just recognizing the divine is in between all these spaces, in between me and my plants. It's in between me and you. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, because it also, that idea combats the binary quality of a lot of religions too, like good versus bad, God versus Satan, where if we recognize that space between, there's a lot of beauty there.
Absolutely. And there's so much peace in that, because we accept things the way they are instead of trying to make them the way we want them to be.
Exactly.
In other traditions, non-monotheistic traditions, because monotheism is going through, I have to say, a harsh time, but it's gonna pass, inshallah, as we say, if it's God's will, and if we put enough efforts, monotheism will become inclusive again, mainstream monotheism. But in Asian tradition, you still have those stories and mythologies about God being the giver, but also the one who is distracting our equilibrium in order for us to find a new way to interact with one another, with ourselves, and with the entire universe. So that idea that peace is static and uniformity, and we'll all will get to a peaceful stage in our for our humanity, the day everyone will be the same, is really an illusion. Diversity and diverse beliefs and cultures and colors and smells and everything else is part of God's creation on earth. What are we going to make out of that is our responsibility, as I said before. So that's really amazing when you think about it like this. You can call it God, you can call it universe, you can call it consciousness. I don't really care because it's only words. But what's behind the interaction and the co-creation with that huge energy that came up with this creation is something that is mesmerizing.
Wow, you're right. So I loved a bit ago you were talking about the inclusivity of the mosque that you were a part of developing in Paris. So, part of my angst with American Christianity and one of the reasons that I cannot subscribe to it is because of their belief that they are the only right way, meaning they are the only ones who have a true connection to God. And so when they're saying we're right, you're wrong, in order for you to have life, you have to come to us and believe like we do, just seems so antithetical to the idea of any message I learned about in the Bible growing up. But the fear of Christians is that the other major religions also feel that way about them, that people who follow extreme Judaism or extreme Islam are also thinking they're the only ones who are right. And I think that's where a lot of the problems in the Middle East come from, is that you have this clash of major religious belief systems, and they're all saying we are the only ones who have the true word of God. We are the only ones who have a path to the real divine. And so, of course, there's going to be conflict, right? But part of the mosque that you're speaking of, that belief system is not part of the foundation there.
Absolutely not. No, we believe that Islam is not a religion. It's a philosophy of life, giving us axiological, moral principles, universal principles and values that have been transmitted from one generation to the other for centuries now, that we have to implement our own way in our communities in order to fulfill that, peace of Islam. But I do not believe that Islam is a dogmatic belief that everybody has to believe the same way in God, practice the same spiritual practices, and so on and so forth. Because as you said, that's the beginning of the end of that ideal that we call peace or God or whatever the name we put there. So really, I believe that spiritual practices are helping us to be better human beings. But the moment some, elite with a lot of power and money try to grab that ideal, like in any other community, even in political ideologies, it was historically the same problem. Big ideals, big words, and in the end, only a few powerful men take all the leadership and start to impose their power, reinforce the boundaries, scapegoat minorities, and then point fingers at, under quotes, others. So that's the beginning of what I call personally like an ideological cancer. It starts with minorities, and then it combats the entire civil society, the entire population. It happens so many times in our human history that it could not be a coincidence. It's really an atavic animal instinct of we are facing danger, so we have to survive. And unfortunately, that fear of we're not going to survive, we have to kill the weakest and sacrifice them and build something stronger on their bodies is really, really, really the basis of those fascistic patriarchal ideologies during last century, World War, during 19th century, thing that happened in Europe and elsewhere, and 20th century, beginning 21st century in Middle East. So really, it's the same story, just the facade is more greenish, more bluish, more brownish, but the ideology, the underlying mechanisms of we have to survive, even if we have to kill everybody else, is really like a cancer, because in the end, everybody dies
Yeah.
and there's no God. You know,
Yeah.
when I came back to religion after a few years of being an atheist, because it was too hard for me to try to reconcile both, I had that thought of, um, it's like I have everything in life in terms of material life to be happy, but still something is missing. Something I had when I was a little child with my grandmother, just praying, meditating early morning before sunrise, and that was really happiness. And I was full of the universe. You know, I was connected to this universe, and I was so uh, excited uh, by the fact that I was going to be able to study and discover more about that. So I came back to spirituality, telling myself, I want to see God living amongst us. And that was like, it was not my thought. It was coming from someone else. And I'm still on that path. It could not be any other way. Of course, it's very hard nowadays with everything, all the identity and political and geostrategic tensions that we have to face. But I'm so happy to have uh, listened to that voice that if God exists, we have to make it alive amongst us, between us.
When you even said a minute ago, if with all the major religions, and if that cancer persists, then everyone dies. And if everyone dies, there's no God, which just kind of backs up what you were just saying, is that we have to hear that voice in order to actively engage.
And that's our responsibility. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I try to speak to the dumbest person in this podcast, and that dumbest person is me. So can you educate me on Ramadan?
Ramadan is the name of a lunar month, because Arabs used to establish their calendar according to the moon. Traditionally, that's a month where you fast, you pray more, you work less, you meditate more, you give more money to the poor, and so on and so forth. So that's a tradition that is very much still very much alive amongst our communities in I'm Muslim, and that's a beautiful month. Maybe that's my favorite month of the year, because
What month is it?
Ramadan.
But when in the calendar that I use, where would Ramadan fall?
Yeah, but that's the thing. The trick is that it follows the moon, so there's solar calendar. So, for example, this year it was just because before summer. Next year, inshallah, is going to be around spring.
Okay.
Every year you take 11 days from the solar calendar, from your calendar, as you said, and you get the date for the first of the month of Ramadan.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a beautiful practice, because it gives you more time to reflect and more time to invest yourself into social and humanitarian work.
It's so interesting because when I had this conversation with Ani too, all the things that I was learning, I was like, I'm on board with this. Sign me up, But it's not the rhetoric that's created, at least here in the States, because again, what we just talked about pitting one against the other. What is the rhetoric like for Islam in France? Because there are a lot of migrants from North Africa to France. So I know that there's a large Muslim population, especially in Paris. What is it like on the news and stuff like that, or in media as it relates to Islam?
Yeah, complicated topic, because in France, people tend to mix two different factors: ethnicity and religiosity. So they used to speak about Arabs 40 years ago, like North African, they mean, and now they're just speaking about Muslims. And you never really know, and I think they don't know, mainstream French people, if they are afraid more of Islam as a religion or Islam as a culture with a capital I. So, but generally speaking, there's an atmosphere of Islamophobia, racism, fear, discrimination, / etc. that is raising now for, I mean, basically since 9/11, because we had more or less not as high as you had too, but we had the same kind of consequences in terms of being afraid of the other. From a Western perspective, in France, that was Muslims mainly because, as you said, we had waves of migrations, especially after decolonization of North Africa, because France was colonizing Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco for more than 130 years. They were in Algeria, in my country where I was born, and I'm French nowadays. So it is possible, to reconcile those identities also, and to make peace between two nations like France and Algeria. But it's also creating, of course, tensions and backlashes and misunderstandings and memories that are not still not expelled from any kind of hatred and fear and so on. So yeah, that's the context in France. And plus we have the biggest Muslim community in Europe, that's in France. We have the highest rate of interfaith marriages between Muslims and non-Muslims in France compared to other European countries. We have one of the poorest Muslim population community in France compared to other European countries. So, it's so much, so many factors intertwined that it's complicated to understand. I mean, when you study that deeply and with the highest scrutiny, of course, you will find some very interesting data. There's very interesting studies about Muslims integration, Muslim radicalization, Muslim progressive movement in France. Why did it start here in Europe, in France, and in no other countries like UK or Netherlands or whatever? So that's very interesting. But mainstream French population is not looking at that with the deepest, attention. It's just about, what are they doing? Some people are bombing us, and terrorist attacks and war everywhere in Middle East. So of course it's creating that misunderstanding and fear atmosphere that we have also to face. We have to understand where it's coming from and try to bring our part of efforts in terms of deconstructing those tensions as progressive, inclusive Muslims.
Exactly. And you're doing that. And I mean, just by you being on this show, I'm so thankful for your voice. What was it like? I mean, because it's actually, as you were just referencing it, I just realized that this episode's going to fall on the week of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. What was it like at that time to know that a group of people just took your religion and shit on it on a world stage and squashed any hope that you were having at that point of advancing equality and advancing God's presence in the world? What was that like for you at that time?
Personally, it was a disaster. I had how do you call that in English? I fainted the next day because I was too stressed. I had nightmares all night long. I was very stressed about what's going to happen for those poor people in the towers in the USA, for the international tensions around Middle East, for us as Muslims in France. So yeah, I think for everyone it was a big trauma. But it was a turning point because I think that more and more Muslims got out from the shadow at that time, didn't let Islam between the hands of the same patriarchs full of power and money, as we said before, and stepped forward from that point or a few years later in order to take the power from their hands and say all together loudly more and more loudly after a few years now, after more than 20 years, we are Islam. So Islam is not Mr. Islam. You could not call Mr. Islam and ask him, what is your point of view about homosexuality, interfaith dialogue with Jewish communities, Muslim women's rights, and so on? No, we are Islam. So if there is some universal values in those traditions, we have to expel them from the cultural background, from the prejudices and the tensions and the fears, and apply them in our everyday life. And that's God, as we said before. God is not up in the sky, very far away, punishing us when we are making any kind of sin, as they say. I don't believe in that. I believe that we are judging ourselves, and we are starting to be mature enough to see that there's real consequences for our acts in terms of violence, hatred, pollution, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, you're right. And even just now, you saying that you were declaring we are Islam, you're saying to the world, we are peace. That's not Islam. We are Islam. I love that.
Yes, and we can extend that to, sorry. Yes.
No, I was just going to say, I'm just so thankful that you were living that example, because like, you know, I mean, just watching the news, one is going to develop an opinion of Islam or any other major religion based on where you are. But this conversation, like, you are Islam. And I'm just so thankful that people are getting to hear that.
Maybe we all are Islam. We all are.
That's peace. What I didn't want to say that, but that's what I was thinking. Because even as a non-Muslim, I want to embody, I mean, I don't embody peace. I have a very short temper and I get angry a lot. But, you know, in my desire to be a more evolved human, I want to represent Islam, you know, just how, and in that I want to represent Judaism. I want to represent Christianity. I want to represent whatever peace entails. I want to embody whatever love is.
Absolutely. You know, personally, I studied psychology, anthropology, and theology. And I started telling myself one day, as you said in the beginning, introducing myself, oh, you've done so much. I don't know. Honestly, I don't really see it like this. I see it as a strategy of survival. And I was at the same time passionate by humanity, by our consciousness, our almost magical potential of transcendence, and also afraid, I have to say, of our potential destructive acts in the future. So I really wanted to understand who we are, and I studied it from different perspectives in order to get more expertise about that topic and our potential of destruction and making God alive at the same time. That's the tension that led someone like me, you know, facing migration, civil war, homophobia, Islamophobia, HIV when I was 19. So it was so much of mess. And all of a sudden you survive and you are like, how can I say, like when someone wants to eat a lot of candies, you want to have a lot of knowledge about who we are and where we're going and where we're coming from. So all those traditions, all those cultures, I cherish them so much. And there's some mystics, you know, when they meditating a lot and then they try to translate what they've seen, what they have experienced. Some of them tell you about the fact that they've seen so many temples and mosques and churches and synagogues and so on gathered in one place, and I think that's why we need so much spirituality and dialogue, and in order to empower ourselves and live together, we need to understand why this is so important for us. So I do believe that, it happens everywhere, with or without religion, that when you mix religion and all those ideals and that very, very strong positive will of transcendence to a given context, it can produce miracles or hell on earth. So that's very important to understand. Why is it so important for us? Why is it so important? Why are you doing that podcast?
Exactly.
Yes.
I still don't know the answer, to be honest. No, the answer is because of conversations like this. Obviously, I mean, it's just this is my church, is getting to talk to people about what drives them, what makes them want to be a better person and leave a legacy. In Christianity, HIV is weaponized as God's punishment for leading a sinful lifestyle. How is HIV seen within Islam? I mean, obviously you're in a more progressive sect, but with the extreme Islamic community, and I hate even calling, just like how I hate calling extreme Christians Christians, because they don't embody the ideas of Christ. I hate calling extreme Muslims Muslim because they are not Islam. You are the Islam. But so how is HIV seen? I mean, being 19 years old, you said, is when you were diagnosed. How was it weaponized against you religiously?
Oh, yes, very much. And there was, that was obviously a very hard part of my life. I just came from Algeria, and then I was in a relationship, and then people associated me with the perversion, and you deserve it because you've done so much stuff. But that was my first relationship, so it was a huge mess. But we should not. I did not exclude that experience from my life. I tried to digest it, to accept it, and to create sense and some kind of spiritual energy out of it, because I had two choices, and I was very young, but still I saw those two choices very, very clearly. I think at that time I had the choice between hating that person and hating everyone else, and living my life, full of anger and tensions and rejection of others. And the second option was just be at peace and accept what's happening, because something good is going to come out from this. And, the temptation is always here, to fall into the other path and start, closing yourself to others and rejecting people who are not exactly like you, and so on and so forth. But I would say, maybe to try to answer, to contribute to your own answer to your question, like, should we call them those extremists and those people full of hate believers like us? I believe so, and unfortunately, but also hopefully, because we are opened enough. I would say we are spiritual, loving, and caring enough in order to understand that we also have that in us. They're not different. It's just that maybe they're not mature enough, or maybe they're too lazy. I don't know, something like that. Maybe both, for sure. But for sure, also, we have that within us. So it would be easy, and at the same time not really authentic, to say, oh, that's because of them. No, that's something that we all have. It's in us. It's part of human nature. And that temptation, the devil, as they say in monotheistic traditions, but the devil is, for me, that, there's a beautiful story about that I told you about the angels bowing to humanity, because we are powerful through our knowledge, our empathy, and our capability to co-create with God, this part of the universe. But there's someone like that devil, Shaitan, Satan. Those are metaphors and names, but there's something very interesting behind that, of course. And that entity decided not to bow in front of consciousness, anyway, because that entity said, I'm better than him, because you created fire, I'm very powerful, and you created that guys from clay, so I'm not going to bow to those people. And that's also something that we still have in us. I'm better than him, so I'm not going to bow, and I'm going to reject him because he rejected me. And then in the end, we're all blind, because we start, pointing fingers in our eyes to one another.
Yeah. And I struggle with that a lot myself, because as someone who is quite antagonistic towards conservatism, I don't have a lot of grace for those that don't have grace, which is hypocritical to my own message. I'm saying I'm better than you are because I see the world more expansively, which in reality is hypocritical just in that statement. But it goes back to what you were saying. It's in all of us. We all have that tendency and that potential to take the wrong path. And it just reminds me again that I use the two wolves metaphor a lot because it just breaks it down so simply in my mind. Where are we putting our energy? Where are we putting our effort? And if it's not on the good wolf, it's going to be on the bad wolf. There's only two options. But you also said something a second ago that I wrote down because it just captured everything about faith. You said, when I asked about, can we call those extreme people something different so that we see the differentiation? And you're saying we can't, but you said, unfortunately and hopefully. And I got chills when you said it, because I was like, that's it. And that captures faith to me, unfortunately, but hopefully.
Yes, that's our human faith. We have to be in the tension to be conscious of our potential, and at the same time, we are complaining and crying upon our freedom of choice. So we complain most of the time not to have the choice to pay bills and taxes and go to work and so on and so forth. And we all been confronted to that kind of situation where you have a very important choice to make, which can change your entire life and your relative's life, and you hesitate so much that you could not choose. So this is just a tiny part of the co-creation that we are all evolving within. So I can imagine like entities like gods and angels. I don't know, those are metaphors once again, but if we imagine that God exists and that entity is trying to elevate us and create like consciousness from clay to pure positive energy, could you imagine all the steps that it takes? That's a miracle in itself.
Yeah.
Better than much more powerful than a God coming and say, I'm gonna create like heavens and earth in 6 days, and literally, not taking that as metaphors, but as it happened like this. So yeah, there's always two faces to one coin. So I would like to have more. You said hypocrisy. I would call it like this. I would call it more psychological tensions, as we say, dysphoria. You have two representations of the word, of yourself, of others, that are not merging into one another to create a bigger, more peaceful one. And that's from this tension, that shock between one positive and one very negative representation of who we are, that we are getting that motivation to move forward. So we can say, oh, God is too hard, you shouldn't be like this, and so yeah, but that's why we are moving forward and learning so much and getting more power intellectually and spiritually. I think that we are getting into an era of higher consciousness. Many traditions are talking about that. You never know. There's so many prophets and mediums telling you this and that. It never happens. Nobody knows. But I really believe that global civilization that is emerging we'll see, that might create something bigger than what we've seen ever before in our humanity. So we'll see. Let's hope for that.
I vote for that. You have a view and a hope of the future that I struggle to maintain. What's going on in Northern Africa as it relates to LGBTQ rights and the spread of HIV there? Here in the States, I think we see Africa as a hotbed of AIDS and HIV still. So are there organizations that you work with to help people either escape restrictive regimes or to get meds, or what goes on there, especially in Algeria, where you might be more familiar?
Yes, absolutely. It's very hard to create an LGBT organization in a country that is criminalizing LGBT orientations and identities and practices, but still there's some alternative underground organizations that we are working with. Some Sometimes we bring leaders of those organizations here in Marseille or elsewhere in Europe in order to have access to training and peer-to-peer counseling and so on about how to do their work on a grassroots level in their context, undercover, of course. So that's also a very, very good example of what we were talking about before, because according to some reports and studies, we never had so much state homophobia and transphobia in North Africa and Middle East than nowadays. And those homophobic, transphobic laws, we have to recall that they have been brought to colonized countries by Europeans when we were colonized by, France, Great Britain. At that time in Europe, they used to consider 19th century, early 20th century, that homosexuality was a disease, a perversion, and so on. We changed our mind since there, of course, but at that time, that was like the mainstream conviction of about homosexuality. So that's very interesting because there's two ways to see it. Maybe those people in power are harshening their fight against minorities because they are more powerful than ever, or perhaps it's just the other way around. They're feeling that their power is very weak, weaker than ever, that those regimes are going to fall. After civil wars, after conflicts, after a lot of tensions and blood, and unfortunately a lot of sadness and negativity. But one way or another, those totalitarian regimes in North Africa and Middle East are going to fall and let the people lead their fate, hopefully in the future. And there's also another very interesting point about that example is that many political leaders and religious leaders, they disagree sometimes on everything else, but they do agree about how to deal with those, under quotes, perverts, as they say. So those people are just forgetting that if they preach, Islam and peace and the nobility of their culture, they could not at the same time, build their dynamic on the back of the poorest, the weakest, the minorities. First contradiction. And the second one is that those values have been imported from elsewhere. It came from Europe. It could have come from, I don't know, Mars or elsewhere. But it came from elsewhere. And now they're making it look like it is our authentic culture, like Islam or African culture never had, sexual or gender diversity before. But, there's so many stories and historical reports about the fact that, sexual freedom at some point was easier to practice, same-sex love and so on in North African and Middle Eastern and Asian countries compared to other parts of the world, like in Europe at that time. So, yeah, it's a very interesting perspective. Studying minorities is telling you so much about the entire society, about an entire given society. So the way those regimes, totalitarian regimes, are dealing with minorities, Jews and homosexuals and women and so on, in their countries, is telling us so much about where that given society is going to. So I think those societies those regimes are going to collapse because they could not survive. There's so much violence and injustice, and people are starving, and it has to come to an end. but unfortunately, it's going to create more sorrow and pain in the next years,
Yeah.
especially on the back of minorities, LGBT or religious
Yes.
minorities. Yeah.
Yes. This conversation has just blown my mind. I'm so thankful again for you being here. I want to see to kind of tie this up. Your message to a few different groups of people. What is your message to Christians and Jews as it relates to Islam on the world stage? What is your message to young queer people who are in conservative Islamic communities? And then what is your message to conservative Islamic communities about the LGBTQ community?
There's a beautiful verse in the Quran telling us, يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم. O you people of the book, so Christians and Jews and Buddhists and all those traditions are quoted in the Quran and the prophets, and it's mandatory for Muslims to respect those prophets and those traditions. That's one of the only religious book where it's written black on white. You have to respect all those prophets because they brought peace and good things to our humanity.
Wait, so in the Quran it says to respect all religions, all
Yes,
leaders.
It's a duty. It's an ethical duty to respect Moses and Jesus, peace be upon them, and all other prophets who came. And Buddha also, Dhul Kifl, is quoted in the Quran. And that verse is very clear about the equality between all our traditions. تعالى إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم. Come to kalima. Come to a word that is equal between you and us, all of us.
I wish
I could remember.
I wish I could see my face right now because there's nothing in the Bible, to my knowledge, that's recommending to respect and appreciate teachings of other religions. It's the opposite, really. And to hear that in the Quran, which is in the media, is so against us. But what you're saying is that the religion itself is simple, black and white, that all religions, all faith systems are equal and to be appreciated.
Oh, yes, they're all words of God. And there's also other verses telling us about priests and monks and rabbis praying God and helping their community. They're going to be awarded by God because they're good people, just like this. So, yeah, those books, as I said in the very beginning of our discussion, were written by man in a time of conflict and tensions and questions. And so there's also two ways to see them. Something that is completely impossible to update, that is useful for nothing, or we can see it as a piece of our human history, a piece of ourselves. So we could study those traditions. That's why I do for 30 years now, because I feel that there's so much wisdom in that. As far as we keep some distance with the context, because the context is not the same at all. They were first Muslims, they were a minority that everybody else around wanted to kill. So of course they did not even have the power. We have to reflect upon that. They didn't even have the power, even if they wanted to impose their representation of the divine to everybody else around them. It was a tribal society, very violent. People were isolated in long distant cities or villages in the desert. So really it was about, let's be at peace, let's establish a new culture. Let's cultivate something new between ourselves. And in a way or another, it worked. Not perfectly, but it worked, because that civilization emerged in less than 100 years from the desert of Arabia, like 1,400 years ago. So for one reason and another, something talked to those people at that time,
Yeah.
told them something, told them about peace and renewing social and political dynamics because it was too violent, too discriminatory, too much about slavery, exploitation, exclusion. So if we take it literally, first of all, we don't understand anything because the context changed. And plus, we're going to apply it in a way that is in contradiction with the values that those texts wants us to apply in our everyday life. So as I said before, we have to keep some distance with the context in order to get the best out of those traditions, like with any other tradition. So once again, it's not falling from the sky. It's up to us to embody those values in our everyday life. That's how I see it.
Well, and also in creating that distance between the context, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, that space between. And that's where God is. That's where beauty is.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you flatten everything and you
Yeah.
don't understand anything to the message of peace.
Yeah.
Come to a word equal between us and you. So this is like something that you can apply to anything and anyone in any situation. Let's come together. We're all equals. We're gonna live together and create something mesmerizing.
Yep.
But if you start, criticizing the other and calling that peace, of course it's not gonna work.
Right.
It's not gonna work.
So what's your message to young queer people who are within these conservative Islamic communities, whether because of their family or geography?
Yeah, my message would be believe in yourself, first of all. My second advice would be never stay alone in front of discrimination and violence and so on. There's always a way to connect nowadays with other people living the same issues just like you. And my third point would be do not believe what they tell you about anything, and especially about religion, spirituality. Islam has to be something that's going to help you to be a better human being, not create more tensions and hate, self-hatred and shame and violence within. That's it. If it's the case, then it's not Islam. It's not religion. It's something
it's not
else.
peace, because Islam is peace.
It's not peace. Absolutely. And we are Islam. So you also are Islam. Let's step forward in a way or another. If it's not then too dangerous for you, connect with other and affirm yourself just the way you are. Because if God exists, and I believe so, God created you and loves you exactly the way you are.
Yeah. Well, what's your message to the conservative Islamic communities then as it relates to the queer community?
Your time has come.
Yes. You were waiting to say that. I could see it.
But that's coming from, from an experience I had a few years ago. We had a debate with very high religious leaders from Egypt and Tunisia, from Al-Azhar University, 1,000-years-old university. And in Tunisia, Zaytuna University, which is like also 1,000 years old, one of the first Islamic university in that part of the world ever. And we've seen with another woman imam from Berlin in Germany, but her background is Turkish, that they understood that now they have to negotiate the norm with other Muslims called progressive Muslims. Because progressive Islam, inclusive Islam, whatever we want to call it, became a reality. It's really a movement internationally, and it's progressing and raising and getting more and more visibility for a few years. Not because we want to be visible. Of course, I would love to do something else from my life than even though it's very interesting to give interviews and to connect with other people on the other side of the world, but about those issues, defending your right to be yourself and to survive the way you want to live, that's something I would have done something else from my life. But as I said, in terms of survival, it was mandatory. It is still mandatory for people like me to still, negotiate with those guys the fact that we are just as human as you. And I think that they're starting to get the message because their model that they imposed for 100 years since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after First World War, for 100 years, they pushed forward their political and ideological agenda. And now that model is falling on the head of every Arab nation. So yeah, your time has come, and now we're ready, I think, and the people of our countries and within our diaspora communities in the West are ready for something else.
Yeah.
Something that we have to invent together, all together. And if the biggest part of our progressive Muslim movement is coming, raising and popping up in the West, in Europe and North America especially, it's for good reason. Because we have more equality, more human rights, more freedom of speech here.
Yeah.
So that's why. But the people there are just starving for that kind of freedom, of course.
Yes.
Not being forced to reject their traditions because they're making them too much suffer too much. But at the same time, not having to cut just a part of themselves because they would tell them that they're not good enough to be good Muslims or good Arabs or good whatever. So yeah, just being ourselves at peace, not fighting against everyone around, is something that the Muslim youth in North Africa and Middle East are thirsty for sure.
Wow. Well, and the last question is, what would you say to the divine were they standing before you?
Oh God.
Literally, yeah. Oh God.
Yeah. I don't think I would have to say anything to God when I'm going to be with God. So I'm looking forward, I have to say, for that moment. But yeah, there's still time, still work to do. That's going to be a wonderful moment. Yeah, for sure.
There's the challenge that you just tied everything up to the extreme religious people. Your time has come, but the challenge to yourself is there's still time. There's still work to do. So we have to use it accordingly.
Yes. I have done a seminar, been part of a seminar in the university in UK a few years ago with a lesbian rabbi, beautiful person, done so much also for years now. And she told us, it's really exhausting because you have to fight on 2 or 3 levels at the same time, and yeah, it's a blessing to be where we are because we can learn so much and try to help as much as possible, and we have that opportunity, that power, that responsibility, of course. But yeah, if it's gonna be done one day, and you go somewhere else on another dimension, and you just discover other ways to be part of that universal dynamic that we call the creation or God or whatever. Yeah, I'm gonna be happy about that. No problem, because it's
my wish and hope for you is that you are able to sustain yourself through health and practices that will allow you to keep using your voice for this amazing effort that you are in the midst of. I'm just so thankful for the hour you've spent with me, for the dedication that your life has towards advocating for the true qualities of Islam, which is peace. This has been, I always say this, but and I mean it every time, but this has been my favorite episode I think I've done yet. So thank you so much for, and where can we find you? Because I also want people to if there's someone who happens to come upon this podcast who's in a bad situation religiously, what resources do you provide through your website for them? Where can we find you online?
So there's the Kalem Institute, CALEM.EU website. And on Facebook or social media, Twitter, you can find my profile, Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed. And thank you very much for the interview. It was a beautiful interview, very graceful, peaceful, very spiritual, actually. So thank you.
As much as I fight spirituality, I can't deny it. I feel like I'm like an agnostic with my feet just cemented in the sidewalk and just being pulled towards spirituality, much against or much to my dismay.
Maybe you're more spiritual than us.
Okay. Anyway, well, I next time I'm in Paris, I will have to look you up and take you to lunch because I just as a thank you for this, and God willing, we'll be out of this pandemic someday, and we can freely travel and hug one another again. It's bedtime for you, it's lunchtime for me, so thank you for staying up late with me, and I'm just so full of gratitude right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much and see you soon, inshallah. Bye-bye.
And all the people said, gay men. Thank you all for listening to another episode of the Fagnostic Podcast hosted by me, Matt Hayes. You can find me at matthayes.com, that's MATHAYES.com, or on Just the Millennial socials at Hayes on It, HAYES on It. Please go subscribe, review, and share this podcast. And in the meantime, peace be with all y'all.
Hi, Michael Spicer here. Matt Hayes forgot to put my name in the credits of his podcast as the composer, but I'm here to tell you that I wrote the music for his podcast. Whatever it's called, I don't know.